could the knight beat Deltarune? Now, some of you asked for Chapter 2, so I have decided to give you Chapter 2. Now, the thing is, unlike Chapter 1, all the other chapters are extremely longer, so if we're going to continue the story, we are going to have to split this into parts. Now, Chapter 2 is not as long as Chapter 3 or Chapter 4, but it is still long to its own right. So this video will be part 1. Now, before we begin, I am going to have to remind you all of the rules of this what if. Now, the rules of this what if is that the knight, well, since the knight is in the world of Deltarune, they are allowed to have all their gear and all their weapons and all their abilities, but they are not allowed to have new weapons like from the shops or from any other point in the story. Now, the knight is allowed to have items from shops, but mostly healing items. Other than that, I will not allow. But with the rest of the rules, it should be fairly the same as the first part, but I am going to change one rule, and that is the charm rule. Now, the charm rule was that I wouldn't allow the knight to give away their charms to the other members of the party because, well, knowing how their character personalities and, well, mainly how they behaved in the first chapter, mainly Susie, I didn't allow them to have charms. But since Chapter 2 is where everyone is more cooperative, I decided and was partially and a part of me was convinced by my friends to change this rule. Now, since I am changing this rule, I will only allow 3 charms to be given per video. Now, 3 charms is because, well, there's 3 members. So each member would only be allowed to have 1 charm. Actually, come to think of it, it's not going to be per video, it's going to be per chapter. So, any charm that I will give them for a chapter, they are stuck with this charm until the chapter ends. Now, other than that, we may begin. Where we last left off was at the ending of Chapter 1. Now, Toriel was kind enough to allow the knight to stay with her and Chris until the knight finds their way back home. Now, since the ending of Chapter 1 was Chris ripping out their soul, originally Chris was alone in their bedroom. But since the knight is staying with Chris and his mother and their mother, the knight would of course be a silent witness to this, because I don't think the sound of a person ripping out their soul would be a very quiet one. So, unfortunately for the knight, they do not have a voice to cry suffering. So, they would have to lay in the bed while witnessing the scene. Now, after that, the things would go fairly normal. Toriel would wake up, go to the kitchen, and she would discover that the pie that she was baking has been ransacked by an unknown culprit. And the evidence was Chris's knife. So, of course, she would believe that Chris was the one to do it. Now, she would, of course, go to their room and, of course, wake both of them up for school. Yes, both of them. Now, since Toriel is a teacher, she has to go to work at school and she's a teacher. Now, here's the thing, right? I believe that even though the knight is a newcomer and, well, a person that's not from around here, I believe that Toriel would, of course, make the knights go to school. After Toriel would wake the two up, C would tell them to get ready for school while C would go start the car. Now, both of them would, of course, venture all throughout Chris's house while the knight is just witnessing Chris's reaction. Now, this would, of course, go the same as it would in deltarune. But once they would get to the car, Toriel would allow Chris to enter, but C would stop the knight before they would enter the car. Because Toriel would, of course, would see the knight's nail. Now, C would see how sharp it is, and C would tell the knight that they are not allowed to bring dangerous items within the school. So C would send the knight back into the house to dispose of their nail, and would tell them to come back after. Now, would the knight actually do this? No, they would not. They have devoted so much geo and materials to upgrade the nail into its final form. So the knight would, of course, trick Toriel by going into the house, but instead of throwing away the nail, they would hide the nail into their cloak and return to the car. Now, thanks to the knight's deceivery, they would, of course, all three of them would venture to the school, and Toriel would, of course, tell the knight how much they would possibly like the education system, even though we all know that the knight would despise the education system. But once they would get to the school, here's what I would think would happen. Now, I don't believe that the knight would be enrolled in Chris's class, because I believe in the funny headcanon that everyone thinks that the knight is a kid due to their size. So because of that, the knight would, of course, be enrolled in Toriel's classroom. So because of that, Chris would, of course, go into their classroom while the knight is dragged into Toriel's classroom and will be subjected to what I would possibly assume would be the equivalent to CIA torture. Now, because of that, the school day would, of course, go entirely the same as it would in the game. After a number of hours of unwanted education, the knight and their classmates will, of course, be finally let go out of school, but not without homework, which the knight has no idea what to do with. So, after wandering the halls for a brief second, the knight would, of course, catch the sight of Chris and Susie. Now, obviously, the knight would, of course, go up to the two, and Susie would, of course, recognize the knight, and she would be like, "Oh, it's you. Now, we're going to go to the closet if you want to join us." And the knight will, of course, obviously accept the invitation, because the knight needs to find a way back to Hollowness, or at least God home. So pretty much, the duo would, of course, become a trio, and all three of them would, of course, make their way to the closet. But before all three of them would, of course, enter the closet, they would, of course, be stopped by a female voice, and that voice belonged to Noelle. Now, before they would enter, Noelle would, of course, disturb them and wonder why all three of them are standing suspiciously around the closet. Now, obviously, they cannot just tell her that there is an entire other dimension behind the closet, because obviously they don't think that would, of course, be a very believable statement. So they would, of course, give a response, which would, of course, either be one of the two options in game. But whatever it is, Noelle just came to invite Chris and Susie, mainly Susie, to invite them to work on their projects together. Now, obviously, the knight has no idea who is in the school besides Chris and Susie, but of course, Noelle would, of course, notice the knight. Now, Noel wouldn't recognize the knight and wonder if they are a new student, but Noel would of course quickly find out that the knight is just as quiet as Chris, even though the knight would of course be way more quiet than Chris. But other than that, after a good brief moment of Noel and the knight having a staring contest, which Noel would have obviously lose, Noel would of course say, well, anyways, you two are invited to the computer lab to work on our projects while she would begin to leave. But before she leaves, she would of course hand Susie a box of chalk. Now, once she does, she would of course make her way to the local library and leave the three standing there and wondering what that gesture was about. Now, obviously the knight wouldn't really have an idea, and to be honest, I don't think that they would have really cared about it. But other than that, Susie would have the suspicion that she might be onto their secret identities. But other than that, they would turn around and reface the closet. And once they would open the closet and they would jump into the dark world. As they fall into the dark world, the clothes of Chris and Susie would of course change into their dark world forms, while the knight would remain in the same outfit as they were before. Once they would land, they would of course enter Castletown as it's still quiet as before. Eventually, after standing around for about 1 second, Rose would of course come rushing up to the three and of course greeting them. Now, Rose would of course greet them and say that he has never waited so long on friends before, even though they have only been gone for about a day, or at least a quarter of a day and an entire night. But whatever, it has not been that long. So after Rose and Susie would of course chat for a bit, Susie would realize that they are the only group of people within Castletown. More importantly, the only people within this dark world. Now, Susie would of course ask Rose, where is everybody? Now, Rose would reveal that the people that was within the Card Kingdom technically no longer exist anymore, even because, well, the Card Kingdom no longer exists because Chris has returned light to that world. So, because of that, the people who dwelled within the Card Kingdom are now pretty much stuck in their light world forms, which is pretty much just the items within the empty classroom right next to the door. So Rose would instruct Chris to exit Castletown and collect every single piece of items that is within the room next to the closet and return everything to Castletown. Now, as Chris would of course be temporarily exiled to run this errand run, Rose would take this moment to learn a bit more about the knight. Now, here is the reason why Rose is doing this. Now, a bit of spoilers, but since this is a what if, I would of course assume that most of you would already assume that there would be spoilers. But anyways, Rose would do this because of the prophecy. Now, the thing about the prophecy is that the prophecy that Rose told our heroes last time was more of a summary than the whole ordeal, because Rose knows the entirety of the prophecy, but he noticed that there was a discrepancy with recent events. Pretty much the entirety of last adventure. And that discrepancy was the knight. Now, the prophecy stated that there would be 3 heroes. A human, a monster, and a prince of the dark. Not a 4th hero. So, Rose would be wondering, so what role is the knight filling? Are they filling the monster, or is there some other part of the prophecy that Rose has somehow looked over? But besides that, Rose would try their best to learn as much about the knight as they can. So pretty much, Rose would of course ask the knights where they have come from, but they would remember that the knight has no vocal cords. So pretty much they would of course just look at each other until Rose would break the silence by telling the knight that he appreciated everything that the knight has done so far for helping them throughout the adventure through Carter Kingdom and pretty much assisting them on being heroes. But of course, Rose would of course tell the knight that they are also a hero, just Rose has a bit of confusion in their voice. So other than that, Rose would of course tell the knight that they are welcome within Castletown as long as they need. So pretty much, Rose would of course be talking to the knight and to Susie, but eventually Chris would return with everything. Now, once Chris would return, Susie would ask, so where is everyone? But once Susie would finish her sentence, the entirety of Castletown would of course change in a blink of an eye. As Castletown would of course change, every person from Card Kingdom would of course now be in Castletown. But they would all quickly realize that almost everyone in Castletown right now is currently everyone that they pretty much was enemies against. But luckily, one of them was Lancer. Now, Lancer would of course reunite with Susie and the group, but Susie would of course ask, so hey Lancer, good to see you, but what happened to your castle? And Lancer would of course say that his castle is gone, completely gone, because since Chris returned light to the Dark World within Card Kingdom, pretty much the entirety of the world and every structure within it is now gone, even though Rose explained it a bit earlier. But Lancer pretty much says that he is now completely homeless. So Susie would of course wonder, well, where is Lancer going to stay now? And pretty much Lancer says, let's go conquer Ross's castle, and runs off ahead. Now Lancer and the group would of course rush ahead, but the knight would of course stay behind a little bit, because the knight remembered one of his skills, and that skill was Dreamgate. Now, Dreamgate is an ability in Hollow Knight where the knight uses their dream nail to teleport to wherever they desire. Now, the knight would of course try to use the Dreamgate to return to Hollowness, but due to an unknown force, the knight would of course be unable to return from whence they came. So, out of frustration, the knight would of course return to the group. Now, since we are currently in Castletown, there is obviously a lot of things to do, but but for the sake of the what if, I'm going to cover the important parts. Now, before the group goes to Rose's castle, they would of course enter Psalm's shop. Now, Psalm was the shopkeeper to pretty much allow them to access the devil secret fight. But now, some, of course, would recognize the heroes and welcome them back. Now, they would, of course, talk and pretty much chat for a bit, but then they would reveal that they defeated Jebel. Now, some would, of course, be surprised that they even defeated Jebel, but he would be more surprised that Jebel had a dark crystal. Now, some would, of course, reveal the importance of these crystals. Now, some would say that if they would collect more of these crystals, some would, of course, be able to probably make something special for the group. Now, do we know what this item is? We only have a vivid idea of right now, but each party member would, of course, have their own idea of what this item would be. Now, the knight would, of course, believe that this item would be a new charm, but some would also warn our heroes that the beings who most likely hold the dark crystals would also most likely be tougher foes than they would usually face. So with the warning and with the information and with some items that they probably purchased, they would be sent on their way. Now, as they would make their way to Ralsei's castle, Ralsei would, of course, tell our heroes that the more people they would recruit, the more the town would grow. But since the knight is here and their violent tendencies, Ralsei suggests that they would, of course, try to be as peaceful as they could, and more importantly, as convincing as they could to try and recruit more people to Castletown. But eventually, they would, of course, make it to Ralsei's courtyard. Now, once they would, of course, reach the courtyard, they would enter Ralsei's castle. As they would enter the castle, Ralsei would, of course, go up to his cauldron and, of course, would bake everybody a cake to share. But once the cake would pop out of the cauldron, Susie would, of course, devour it all in one bite, even though the cake was meant to be shared amongst the four. Now, after that, Ralsei would reveal that he has a surprise for all three of them, and that surprise was rooms. Now, once they would, of course, go up to the upper level of the castle, they would see the rooms that Ralsei was going to surprise them with. Now, we already know what Chris's room looks like and what Susie's room looks like, but what would the knight's room look like? Now, after some consideration on my part, I made the brave assumption to imagine that their room would look like probably something from the City of Tears. So the knight would, of course, have a room similar to the architecture within the City of Tears, within Hollowness. But even though it may not exactly be the same from the City of Tears, it would, of course, have the vibe and, of course, would, of course, look like something from Hollowness. But regardless, Ralsei wanted all three of them to feel that this castle and Castletown a whole would be more like a second home from wherever they came from on Ralsei's part. But after inspecting their rooms and, of course, after inspecting some beds, they, of course, would eventually make their way to the dungeon and be greeted by a unfortunate familiar sight, and that sight was King. King would see our heroes, and he would wonder and ask, have they come to humiliate him any further? Ralsei would try to lighten the mood by asking if King would want to reconsider his position so that he might be able to live with the other residents of Castletown. But King would shut this offer down immediately because he finds it less humiliating than to rot in the cell rather than living in a kingdom ruled by the Lightners. But besides that, any other attempt to try to talk to King would of course shut it down by saying that he has nothing to discuss, because after all, they are the reason why he is in this cell, even though it was King's own action that landed him there. But before our heroes would leave the dungeon, King would stop all four of them by asking if his son Lancer is happy. Susie would wonder why King would even care, but King would see that his bluff was too effective on them, because if King were to do that, Lancer would of course bounce all the way back up to him, because Lancer is King's little bouncy boy. But besides that, our heroes would of course tell King that Lancer is doing fine, and they would all leave the dungeon. As our heroes would leave, King would of course be more interested in the fourth party member, the Knight. Now, I would assume that King would of course also know about the prophecy, and of course mainly the three main heroes, but the fact there is a fourth member in their party rather than just three members would also spark his interest, because King would of course believe that there is probably more to this unknown hero than meets the eye. After wandering around for a bit in the rest of Castletown, Chris would of course lead the party back to the entrance to the Dark World. Well, actually back to the entrance to Castletown. Now, when they would reach this point, Susie would ask that why are they there? Then, to Susie's unfortunate realization, she would ask Chris if they're really wanting to go and work on that project. And once Rose would hear this, he would ask if the three have homework, and because of that, Rose would not be happy about this and promptly banish all three of our heroes until they start their project. Now, and this would of course include the Knight, even though the Knight is not in the same class, but Rose doesn't know that, so the Knight is also banished. But before they were promptly kicked out, Lancer would of course invite himself into the party. Well, not into the party, but Lancer would of course join our heroes by going into Chris's pocket and entering and becoming an inventory item. Even though Rose didn't think this would be a good idea, but after Lancer would do that, Rose Card would also do the same, even though nobody wanted him to join in the first place, including the Knights. Now, before they could leave again, the original Starwalker would of course join the party and enter Chris's inventory. Now, Susie would want to leave before any other people get the same idea, so they would of course be banished and exit the Dark World. After exiting Castletown, our three heroes would of course realize, well, Chris and Susie would realize that they practically now have no choice but to do this school project. So Susie would of course say that we'll just tell Chris to let's just get this over with. So Chris and Susie would of course leave, and the Knight would of course try to use their Dream Nail again to attempt to return to Hollowness after Chris and Susie would of course gain some distance away from the Knight, but of course this would of course still end in failure. Now Susie would of course tell the Knight, well, she would ask the knights, are they coming or not? So pretty much the knight would go along with Chris and Susie, because if there is any way back to Hollowness, the best bet is have to do with probably the Dark Worlds. So the knight would of course follow Chris and Susie to the library and outside of the school. Now, once they would make it down towards the library, they would see a massive traffic jam, and also the sight of Undyne bench pressing a entire whole car with the person inside, of course. Now, Undyne would of course explain the traffic jam was caused by a certain someone, but she would also tell them that it's probably also dangerous for all three of them to be there, so she would tell the group to skedaddle or something bad would probably happen. Now, they would of course enter the library because it would probably be a good thing, because knowing the knight, they might try to challenge Undyne and, well, probably also challenge the caller, so it would be a good idea to enter the library at that point. Now, of course, when they would enter the library, they would of course notice there is a bit of a lack of people in the library. Now, of course, nowadays that's not really a strange thing, unfortunately. But for the sake, but of course, Chris and Susie would wonder where is Edwin, while the knight would of course inspect the library, because if there's anything that the knights would appreciate about this new world, it would of course be information. Now, this is where I'm going to say that the knights can of course understand what the people in the world of deltarune would say, but I'm not going to say that the knight would of course understand their written language. So when the knight would of course take one of the books, they would of course realize that they do not know how to read. So unfortunately, to the knight's frustration, they're not going to understand anything. Now, while the knight is inspecting the books, Chris and Susie would of course go up to the entrance to the computer lab, and they would of course open it to see a new dark world. Now, of course, Susie would of course say, well, we can't do our project if, well, the entire computer lab is now a dark world. Now, Chris would of course say that they have a computer at their own house. Now, Susie would of course will say, well, Chris, you're right, but unfortunately I'm your partner. So of course, while they would of course talk about the dark world, the knight would of course go past the two of them and just jump in the dark world. Now, of course, Chris and Susie would of course follow the knight, and this is where they would enter the cyber world. Now, the same thing would happen upon entering the cyber world. The appearance of Susie and Chris would change, while the knight would of course remain the same as they ever were. But when they would land into the new dark world, they would of course see the vast difference immediately, because unlike Castletown, this world is a lot more cybernetic. Now, they would of course venture into the outskirts of the cyber field, and they would of course be greeted with the same eerie silence, of course, of the dark world, as just like they first experienced when they in their first adventure. Now, of course, they would of course enter. Well, not enter. They would of course see the Plug Boys. Still don't know why that's their name, but I'm going with it. So they would of course interact with the Darkners, and they would of course tell them about, well, what just happened. Now, they would give a few warnings, but our heroes would of course venture further in. Now, they would of course come across the electric wire obstacle. So the knight would of course just dash right through it while Chris and Susie would navigate through it. But once they would of course make it out of there, they would of course be greeted with a familiar sight, and that was the sight of Noelle. Now, Noelle would be on her knees pleading for help, but she would of course quickly recognize the trio. Now, she would warn all three of them to get out of there, but before she could do anything, she would of course be trapped in a cage and taken away. Now, due to the suddenness, I'm going to assume that the knights couldn't really do anything because, well, because what just happened would have been so fast. So for the story, let's just say Noelle would still be captured. Now, before they could try to free Noelle would be taken away, and they would of course hear a very regal laugh, and that laugh belonged to none other than Queen. Now, Queen would of course greet our heroes. Queen would introduce herself to our heroes by her serial number, but she would simplify it by asking them to call her Queen. Now, Susie wouldn't want to call her Queen, but she would also fail badly to pronounce her full serial number. So Queen would of course tell Susie to call her Queen by summoning another Queen pop-up. Now, Susie would tell Queen that they are not children, but Queen would correct Susie by saying that teens are much bigger children, and she would also assume that the knight is their pet bug, and the knight only has a repetitive brain function, so Queen would also assume that the knight is very stupid. So she would try to retort Queen by saying that wouldn't that make her stupid too, but Queen would come back to Susie by telling her that she is a computer, so she is instantly smart, and most likely the smartest person to ever lived. I added that last part, but pretty much their banter would be stopped by Susie asking why she even captured Noelle. Now, Queen would say that she will make Noelle her winning peon, and possibly turn her face into a robot, and also she also wants to take over the world because it's cool. Now, obviously, not going to allow Queen to do that. Now, Queen would ask our heroes if they want to fight, and obviously the knight would hit Queen with a challenge pose, but Queen would of course say, well then, fight. And now, Queen would of course try to fly away, but unfortunately for Queen, the knight would be able to sneak in a vengeful spirit and hitting her chair and also damaging it. Now, while Queen would try to regain control of her chair, she would also summon 2 werewires, well, maybe 3 werewires, to stall our heroes from possibly catching up to her. Now, since this is the first battle, I would assume that since Rosie's not here, it's going to be a bit challenging for Chris and Susie, but luckily for the knight is a nail master, so while Chris and Susie handle the werewire's attention, the knight would instantaneously cut off the wires and free the darkness that were under Queen's control. Now, because of that, they would try to catch up to Queen because hopefully to them, she possibly crashed her chair and possibly is on her feet now. But before they could try to catch up to Queen, they would be immediately greeted with a new pack of werewires. Now, before they could even try to fight them, they would be graciously bailed out of that situation by Rosie's pacify spell. Now, once the freed werewires would of course be gone away, they would be greeted with a much nicer encounter, which is Ralsei. Now, Ralsei would of course go up to our heroes and greet them and tell them that he had felt a dark presence and made his way over to this dark world. Now, does he explain how he does this? Nope, no he does not. That is still one of the greatest mysteries to this day and at this point of time. Now, they would of course be happy to see Ralsei, and of course Suzy would say that nothing beats a good adventure, so they would of course be reunited and strike their group pose. Now, after they strike their group pose, they would of course venture forth into the deep cyber fields. Now, pretty much, they would of course look at the great scenery, and they would dodge some obstacles, and of course they would fight some of the enemies that they would encounter. Now, the battles would not really be that bad since the knight and Ralsei is there, so pretty much they would just breeze past them. Now, eventually they would of course catch up the queen. Now, Queen wouldn't really be too happy that her chair is kind of destroyed, but luckily she has spares. So, but before she would notice our heroes, she would be trying to convince Noelle to be a willing peon. Is this working? No, it's not. So, they would of course tell Queen to free Noelle, and they would not let her turn Noelle's face into a robot. Now, Noelle would be surprised that this is what Queen is trying to do, and Queen would say, well, that was supposed to be a surprise. But before Noelle could ask any more questions, Queen would send her away. Now, obviously the knight still wants to fight Queen, so the knight would still try to attack Queen, but for the sake of the story, Queen would keep the knight at bay with bug spray. Now, before they could do anything else, she would tell the heroes to wait. Now, pretty much, Queen would ask if they would want to be their willing peons, because if she's gonna have willing peons, they must have the willing part. Now, obviously, they're not going to choose that, so Queen would do the next best thing. If she can't humiliate them directly, she will humiliate them via video game. So, she would summon one of her SWATlings, and they would bring a giant arcade machine. Now, pretty much, none of our heroes can actually properly play the game by themselves, because none of them are tall enough, especially our knight. Now, pretty much, eventually they figured out, so if they're going to beat Queen at this video game, they're pretty much going to have to form a human tower thing. Pretty much they all stack onto each other, so pretty much Ralsei's a stool, Susie's a support, and Chris is pretty much the pilot. So pretty much you're seeing it on screen. But what would the knight do? So two things. So the knight is either going to stand there, or the knight is just going to probably cling on the back of Susie's back with their mantis claws and pretty much be a silent watch. Just pretty much the knight is just going to be a audience member, pretty much. So the knight is just going to be a very silent backseat gamer. So other than that, the arcade segment would just really go the same way. So they would beat Queen, and so after they defeat Queen and after the knight's live reaction, Queen would once again offer our heroes to either join her or perish. Now, obviously, they would choose the perish and oppose Queen, so Queen would of course go on her merry way. Now, the knights non-visibly aggravated by being held at bay by a bug spray, but all four of them would continue on towards their goal. Now, they would of course venture on, and they would encounter a force field which is blocking their way. Now, they would of course decide to try and find a way to deactivate it, but also there are two shopkeepers who are offering to, well, they're pretty much wanting to sell 400 bagels. Now, unfortunately for our heroes, with their combined strength, they will not be able to carry that many amounts of bagels, so they would of course continue. Now, obviously they would encounter the hacker. Now, pretty much the hacker wants our heroes to collect 3 blue check marks, so they would agree, and they would pretty much continue on further. So as they would venture on, they would of course solve more puzzles, and they would of course encounter the task. Now, thanks to the knight's strength, they would of course be driven off, but pretty much with enough blue check marks, and pretty much, well, we're not there yet. So eventually they would venture on, and they would reach the teacups ride. After riding all 3 teacups, they would of course eventually find the right one. Now, after riding the right one, they would of course step onto a platform, and they would encounter Sweet. Now, Sweet would of course try to stop our heroes while they were temporarily cornered, but of course the platform would reach its destination, and Sweet would of course be the one at a dead end. Now, with all 4 of our heroes cornering Sweet, Sweet would of course call upon his friends. Now, Sweet, Captain, and KK would of course come to Sweet's aid, and they would pretty much claim that our 4 heroes are working with Queen, and they are the last resistance against her. Now, Susie would of course try and tell the 3 that they are actually working against Queen, but unfortunately to the 3, they would of course start bickering, and as of course they were to bicker, and eventually they would start bickering amongst themselves, our heroes would of course start to lose interest. Now, before our heroes could walk away, the 3 members of the resistance would of course start a battle. Now, pretty much, since this is I don't want to call it a boss battle, but it kind of is, so let's just say this is a mini boss battle. I don't know. So pretty much, since Sweet, Captain, KK are so determined to fight our heroes, the knights would get an idea. So the knights would of course go up to our 3 heroes, and this is where the knights would give them their charms. Now, I have decided to give our heroes these 3 charms. Rose would of course get Spell Twister, because knowing how Rose is mainly the support member of the group, and he's pretty much the main sorcerer. Spell Twister is a charm that heavily reduces the cost of casting magic, and knowing how good Rose's healing spell is, Rose would pretty much become busted at this point. So Rose would be given Spell Twister, so now Rose can pretty much just spam heal prayer at any point in a battle with enough TP. Now, Susie was a very interesting choice. Well, by interesting, I mean pretty much I had a lot of decisions to give to Susie when it comes to charms. Now, I have decided to give Susie Unbreakable Strength. Now, knowing how strong Susie is, and Susie's pretty much the main powerhouse of the base 3, I decided that one of the smart decisions to give her a charm would pretty much be Unbreakable Strength. Now, Unbreakable Strength was originally Fragile Strength. Now, Fragile Strength used to be if you die, in Hollow Knight, the charm would pretty much shatter. But thanks to the Grim Troop and that one member in the Grim Troop, Fragile Strength became Unbreakable Strength, and pretty much Susie is now way more stronger than she was. Now, I'm not saying that Susie would become One Punch Man, but Susie would pretty much be a bit more stronger than she would, of course, be. Now, then we have Chris. Now, when I was deciding what charm to give Chris, it came down to either giving Chris Nail Master's Glory or giving Chris Mark of Pride. But knowing what's coming in the future, I think Mark of Pride would be the smarter option. So pretty much Mark of Pride gives the user more attack range. So pretty much Chris now has a long sword instead of a broadsword. Now, with the knight giving these charms, the knight will of course take these charms back once this adventure is over, because I do not believe that the knight would just simply allow the three to just keep the charms until, well, pretty much longer than they are needed. So the knight would give each member a silent look of "I'm expecting these to be given back to me," while he's giving the three their charms. So after this brief pause in the battle, they would of course start going on to the battle. So pretty much in this fight, pretty much you're supposed to get each member of Sweet Captain KK's resistance dancing, but this is pretty much where Ross would introduce the action. So pretty much how it would work, so how I see this battle going in this what if is, the knight would of course not be so merciful, but thanks to Ross, the knights would of course not completely beat him up, but Sweet Captain KK would of course still get roughed up a bit. But thanks to R action and S action, each member of the resistance, and so pretty much everyone started dancing, and pretty much the knights would of course just stand there. Now, after the resistance was pretty much defeated, well, mercifully defeated, well, kinda defeated, I should say, Sweet Captain KK would pretty much say that they have reached a stalemate, and since they are not directly working with Queen, they propose that both sides should have a temporary alliance, and they would of course ask them to rendezvous to their headquarters. Now, as the three would leave, they would of course, the knight and the hero and Chris and the gang would of course venture back through the cyberfield. Now, as they would make their way to the headquarters of the resistance, they would of course return to the hacker and of course give the hacker his blue check mark. Now, the hacker would of course award our heroes with a light show of their faces. Now, pretty much they would of course go towards the headquarters and also witness the scenery of the city and the fireworks show. But eventually they would reach the resistance headquarters. Now, it turns out the headquarters is just a shop. Now they would of course enter, and so here's the thing, right? Now, since Chris is pretty much the person who pays for everything, I don't think the knight would attempt to use Geo again, because knowing how Sham back in chapter 1 really didn't accept that as a currency, and seeing how Chris is mainly paying for everyone, the knight is just going to allow Chris to just pay for whatever he's giving. Now, I believe Chris would, of course, buy some few items. Now, just like I said, I'm not allowing the knight to have new weapons, well, and pretty much, I guess, armor as well. So pretty much, Chris can attempt to buy some armor pieces, but I don't think the knight would probably accept it, because let's just say for more reasons, it would probably slow their movement down. So Chris would buy some healing items and whatever they need for the party. But they would also chat with Sweet Captain and KK. Now, pretty much, they would reveal that Queen was already bad before, but since the Dark Fountain showed up, and of course, well, this knight showed up, Queen has gotten way worse. And they would also talk about her music taste as well, but pretty much they would just reveal that Queen has pretty much gone a complete mad monarch, and C's kinda got to go. So with all that said, our heroes would of course continue on their journey. Now, pretty much they would make their way through the final part of the cyber field. Now, they would of course encounter some of the enemies, and they would of course deal with them, with the knight being, of course, the lead attacker. Now, after they would of course deal with some of the enemies, I wouldn't put a past for I'll say to ask the knight to be a bit more merciful, but the thing is, knowing how the knight practically survived all of Hollowness, I wouldn't really blame the knight for, well, being the knight. Now, pretty much, they would of course reach the teacup rides up towards the roller coaster. Now, after surviving the teacup ride, they would of course enter the roller coaster. Now, each one of them would of course enter their own coaster cart. Now, since each roller coaster is pretty much themed after their rider, and well, unfortunately, I'm not an artist, so I can't really make a cart. So let's just say that, so happenly, there is a robotic stag for the knight to ride. Now, once every party member would of course, their form of transportation on the roller coaster, they would of course set out towards the Dark Fountain. Now, Rose would see that this fountain, well, not the fountain itself, but the roller coaster might lead them straight towards the Dark Fountain itself. So they all of course would continue to ride the roller coaster until they were stopped. Now, they were stopped by none other than Queen, riding a new flying chair, well, throne. But anyways, so C would of course tell the heroes that C has been too merciful so far, so she would of course try and capture all four of them, completely missing them in the process. Now, C would of course say that this was a tactical calculation or something along the lines of that, but pretty much she would of course reveal a new plot twist, and that was Noelle. Now, Susie would of course be surprised to see Noelle here, but Noelle would of course reveal that Queen gave her an offer that she couldn't really refuse. Now, so this would of course go just like normal. So Susie and Noelle would of course start to talk and also compliment each other. But Queen would get bored of this, and she would bring in the next willing peon, and that was Birdly. Now, unlike Noelle, Queen wasn't really too hesitant to, well, make Birdly one of her peons, but seeing the circumstances, she unfortunately had to make him a part of her team. So, Birdly has become her very unintentional knight. So pretty much, Burley would of course tell Noelle that he will be her knight in shining armor and protect her from the heroes. Now, pretty much, Burley sees no value of recruiting Susie or Rose, but luckily for Chris and the knights, he sees value in them. Now, Burley would of course go on about how he would assist Queen in taking over the world and making it a Smartopia. But if Chris would of course join their side, Burley would give them the royal pleasure of scrubbing the royal toilet. Now, Burley, seeing the knight, would offer the knight, if the knight were to join Burley, he will make the knight his squire. Now, unknowing to Burley, the knight has the king's brand, which makes them the king of Hollowknight. Pretty much already is a knight. And pretty much the knight is practically everything that Burley claims to be. So obviously the knight is going to turn down this offer. So, seeing that they are going to decline Burley's offer, this would of course begin the boss fight against Burley. Now, how the fight would go is pretty much the heroes have to try to bump Burley's coaster until Burley is knocked off the roller coaster. So the thing is, right, so this is where we would compare Burley's attacks against the knight. Now, well, pretty much this is where we compare the knight against Burley. Now, Burley has 3 main attacks. Now, there is his tornado attack, there is his halberd attack, and there is his, it's his paper attack, I just remembered. But pretty much, those are his 3 main attacks. But with the knight, so the knight can of course, well, shade dash through the tornadoes, and seeing that the knight has, well, the fully upgraded Pyramid, I can fully well assume that the knight can, well, just slash right through the paper. I think the spear attack would be tricky for the knight because, well, it's his first time seeing it, but once the knight would of course get it down and memorize, I think the knight can pretty much also dash right through it and pretty much can handle it. But how I would see the boss fight going is, since the heroes now have charms, they would of course be way more effective, and the boss fight wouldn't really last that long as it would seem. So how the fight would go is, since the knight has Crystal Dash and is pretty much since on a roller coaster track, the knight cannot just hop off the stag and of course run up to Burley, because, well, then the knight would of course get trampled. So luckily for Crystal Dash, that one of his abilities, the knight can of course dash right onto Burley's cart, and the knight would of course force Burley to actually resort to one-on-one combat up front. Now, since the knight is more experienced in combat, Burley would be quickly overwhelmed. Now, seeing that Burley's attention is solely on the knight, the 3 heroes would of course take their chance and continuously bump onto Burley's cart. Now, this would of course go on for a few minutes, but with enough grit and effort, our heroes would of course defeat Burley, and Burley would of course be sent skydiving off of the roller coaster. Now, after Burley's cart would of course explode. The knight would of course return to their stag just by the skin of their non-existent teeth and land right back on their seat. Now, after that performance, Queen would return to inform our heroes that the roller coaster is not exactly finished. So they would ask, so what would that mean? And then Queen would tell them that that would of course mean pain, and they would of course be sent flying off on cue, while all four of our heroes would of course fall right down into Cyber City. And this is where we will fade to black, because this is the end of part 1. Now, if you'd made it this far into this video, I would like to thank you, because it has taken me probably 7 different attempts to just make What If the Knight was in Deltarune Chapter 2 in general, but I believe this time I finally got it, but unfortunately I had to split this up into parts. Now with a few other things left to say, I know a part of this, in this part, it's pretty much me just recapping the base events of Deltarune, well, pretty much the base events of Chapter 2 in its beginning, but I'm very certain that in the following parts is where we get to see the knight heavily change the story of Chapter 2. Now, of course, I have to also mention, I do not own Hollow Knight or Deltarune in general. They have been made by both of their separate creators. And of course, that also goes the same with their music, but other than that, thank you for watching, and this video is Captain Bones approved. Could the knight beat Deltarune Chapter 2? Now, this is the second part of this What If. If you haven't seen Chapter 1, or well, the last part, you are more than welcome to come back later and watch this part once you're caught up. But if you don't want to, it's perfectly fine. But besides that, where did we leave off? Now, where we left off was our 4 heroes just defeated Birdley, and after they defeated Birdley, Queen informed our heroes that the roller coaster that they were on was not exactly finished. So after riding for about 1 minute after the battle, they proceeded to completely fly off of their cart and stag and completely now fall into the main city of Cyberworld, and that is Cyber City. Now, our heroes would of course land in the trash zone. Now, luckily for all 4 of them, there is a convenient trash pile that they could all land on. Now, knowing and seeing how the knight managed to survive from falling great heights back in Hollowness, I can safely assume that they will not be hurt that bad once they would land on the trash pile. Now, after some time, all 4 of them would of course regain their composure after a near-death experience from falling. Now, Chris, Rouse, and the knight would of course make their way off of the trash pile, but Susie would of course claim herself the king of the trash hill, and she would unfortunately take a bit of a stumble off of the trash pile. Now, she would of course accidentally hurt herself, and Rouse would notice this. Now, Susie would claim that she is fine, but Rouse, insistent on helping Susie, would of course hug Susie and use their healing magic. Now, after Rouse would heal Susie would of course be curious on how Rouse was able to do that. Now, Rouse would of course, explain that it was by magic and asked Susie if she was curious enough to learn about it. Now, Susie would, of course, say that she's not interested, but if Rose wants Susie to learn, I guess it wouldn't hurt her. Now, Susie would, of course, keep this in mind, and also knowing later chapters, this would, of course, be real important for the story. But after they would get their composure, they would, of course, make their way out of the trash zone. Now, eventually, they would, of course, make it to a fork in the road. Now, this is where the story would change. Now, if you played Deltarune, or at least watched it, you would of course know that traditionally the fun game is a number of 3. More importantly, a odd number. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because this is where they would split up. Now, Susie would of course say, why does Chris usually get to make these decisions, and Susie would of course drag Rose along with her, and they would leave Chris alone. But thankfully the knight is here, so that means they are now a group of 4 now. Susie would of course drag Rose along with her, and both of them would split up, and this is where Chris and the knight would of course be left to themselves. Now, unfortunately for the both of them, they are both silent protagonists, so they are not the most talkative. Now, with Chris and the knight being paired up thanks to Susie's decision, I feel like I need to mention this. Now, if you remember, the knight was staying with Torio because Torio believes that the knight is a lost child. Now, the knight doesn't mind helping Chris, but the knight is also skeptical because of the chapter 1's ending. But unfortunately, the knight cannot, well, communicate this to Chris, but the knight will, of course, keep an eye on them. So, with the two having their silent communication, I guess, they would, of course, venture into Cyber City. Now, Chris and the knight would, of course, make their way in through the city. Now, obviously, they would, of course, make it through the traffic while the knight crystal dashes, but unfortunately, the knight is going to have to wait for Chris to catch up. Now, they would also occasionally encounter some pop-ups, but they would also fight them. But unfortunately, just like Susie in Chapter 1, Chris is going to have to warn the pop-ups about the knight attacks before, well, the knight drives them away. Because this is a pacifist and kind of neutral route. So yeah, I'm kind of retconning that. But other than that, Chris is still going to have to warn enemies about attacks thanks to the knight. But after all of that, they would have catch the glimpse of Noelle. And seeing how Noelle is unwillingly stuck with Queen, well, by stuck I mean yeah, but they would, of course, catch up to Noelle. Now, Noelle would, of course, see Chris and the knight, and she would be happy, but also surprised to see that the two of them were there. But before she could ask any questions, she hears the voice of Queen. Now, Noelle would quickly go hide in an alleyway before Queen would show up. Now, Queen would see the knight and Chris, or without Rose and Susie. Now, Queen would realize that she is outnumbered. Now, luckily for her, and for the sake of the story, Queen still has the bug spray, so she would be able to keep the knight at bay, but Chris not so much. So Queen would get an idea. Now, she would suggest that the two of them should not fight her, because seeing that both of them are, well, missing their parties, she suggests a truce. Now, Queen would suggest that if Chris and the Knight would help her find Noelle, Queen could possibly help them to find the rest of their party. Now, before Queen could say anything further, there would be a third voice, and that would be the voice of Burglary. Okay, so just like Noelle, Queen would of course hide atop the alleyway to hide from Burglary. Now, Burglary, seeing Chris and the Knight, and obviously remembering their last encounter, which really did not go so well, Burglary would of course be forced to think of a quick solution, and that solution would be a truce. Now, Burglary would of course give the same exact deal if Chris and the Knight would of course help Burglary find his party. Burglary would help them find their party too. Now, Chris and the Knight wouldn't really give a response in general, so Burglary would of course take that as a yes. And Burglary would of course say that if they were to honor the truce, there would be a great benefit. And before Burglary would leave, Burglary would of course tell the Knight that his offer of taking the Knight up as a squire is still on the table. But if anyone is going to be the squire, it's going to be Burglary, and the Knight as his master. But would that happen? No, not at all. So, after that, Burglary would go on his merry way, and so, after Burglary would leave, Queen would of course come out of hiding. Now, Queen really not wanting to deal with Burglary so soon again, she would of course tell the Knight that pretty much the same thing that Burglary said, just as long as they honor the truce, things would go very well for them. So, now Chris and the Knight has to help Queen find Noelle, and of course, pretty much they have to also help Burglary find the Queen. But are they really going to do this? No, they're just gonna probably just take Noelle and go back to their party. So after Queen would leave, Noelle would be very relieved that she doesn't have to worry about Queen being above her, and even more grateful that she did not lose her grip and accidentally fall on top of her. Now, Noelle would ask if there is any room for a third truce, and for the sake of them trying to rescue Noelle, they would of course agree. Now, Noelle would join the party, and pretty much before they would leave, Noelle would ask Chris about the Knight, and pretty much, unfortunately for Noelle, Chris knows about as much as Noelle does. Well, maybe a little bit more, but not really that much. The Knight really, I don't think the Knight would gain any bad vibes from Noelle, so at this point, Noelle was on okay terms with the Knight, so the Knight wouldn't really care that Noelle was with them, just as long as things don't go too bad. I'm sure they would get along. So, and with that, Noelle joins the party. Now, with Noelle joining the party, I'm going to be honest, I don't think Snowgrave would happen in this what if, because if Chris were to go down that route, I think the Knight would very quickly shut that down, or probably worse. But besides that, Snowgrave would not happen in this what if. Now, I don't know if some of you wanted Snowgrave, but knowing how I'm taking the story so far, I don't think Snowgrave would be a possibility. So, besides that, Chris, Noelle, and the Knight would venture on into the city together. As our heroes venture on, they would obviously encounter enemies. Now, the Knight and Chris know how battles work, even though one wants to spare them and the other kind of wants to attack them because the enemy attacked first. But unfortunately, Noel has never been in a battle before, so everyone would point this out except Noel because he's never been in a battle, and everyone quickly taught Noel how battles work. Now, obviously, he would realize that this is kind of like Dragon Blazers, so Chris would teach Noel how to spare enemies, while the Knight would quickly find out that Noel's attacks are not very effective because he's never really been in combat before. So Noel would, of course, help the party, and they would spare the enemies. Now, the Knight, seeing how Noel isn't really that effective in combat, would realize that it would probably be a good idea to try and avoid battles. So after that, they would venture on. As they would move on, they would reach the first mouse puzzle. Now, Chris and the Knight would attempt to make heads and tails of the puzzle, and they would accidentally activate it. Now, as they would activate it, they would also discover that Noel has a fear of mice. Now, Noel would, of course, explain this a bit, and Chris, being, well, Chris, would activate it again on purpose and would, of course, scare Noel. Now, eventually, Chris and the Knight and their combined efforts would solve the puzzle. Now, they would, of course, move on while Noel would make sure that no mice is following them, and they would venture on. Now, as they would continue, they would, of course, encounter more enemies, as they would either defeat them violently or mercifully spare them. But whatever the case, they would enter a new section of the city. Now, as they would move forward, they would see a billboard of a Ferris wheel. Now, this would remind Noel of the coming festival. Now, the Knight obviously has no idea that there is a festival coming, but they're more focused on, well, the adventure and, well, the power of the Dark Fountain. The Knight would be more focused on the goal of the adventure than, well, any of the side quests. Now, Noel would ask Chris if Susie would possibly go with her on the festival. Now, knowing the player and, well, Chris being, well, the best wingman in the game, they would, of course, say yes, Susie would go with her. Now, this would brighten Noel's mood. Good, but in a way, she still has a lot of doubts in that. So, they would, of course, try and navigate through the city, and they would encounter an Addison. Now, this Addison would attempt to sell them dating suits. Now, Noel would get shy, and she would have tried to explain that Chris and her are just good friends, and they are actually have been neighbors for a really good time for about angel knows how long. But as Noel would explain this, Chris would just respond either way of their choice. But the Addison would also try to sell the Knight suits, but unfortunately the Knight wouldn't fit any of them if they were to try, so all three of them would decline the offer and they would just move forward. As they move forward, they would encounter another force field. Now, with the Knight learning about the puzzles within Cyber City, the Knight would obviously see that the buttons on the ground would most likely deactivate the force field. Now, luckily, the Knight can jump over the force field with a ability, and that ability is Monarch Wings. Now, the knight would of course jump over the force field and would land on the button, allowing Chris and Noelle to come over to the other side safely. Now, Noelle would obviously be surprised to see that the knight has wings, and now she would wonder and, well, ask Chris if they also knew about this. Now, I can't remember at this time if I did mention this in either Chapter 1, but for the sake of it, let's say that the knight possibly used this ability during Chapter 1. So Chris would just have a face of... well, Chris would just have a non-surprised face at this, so Noelle would assume that Chris didn't know about this, and pretty much wonder if the knight can just practically fly. Now, unfortunately, the knight cannot, but the knight cannot just tell Noelle this. After that, they would of course see an opening, and unfortunately, that would be followed by the voice of Queen. Now, since they have Noelle, they don't really want to let Queen know this. So Noelle would of course go back the way they came, while Chris would move forward. Now, I want to say that the knight would follow Noelle just in case of Queen possibly seeing her, but so Chris would go interact with Queen, while the knight would of course go with Noelle, so to, well, either protect her from either enemies or from some other source. So pretty much the same thing would happen with Queen and Chris. Queen would of course explain her reasons of why she is doing this, while Birdly would unfortunately find Queen. But since Noelle was also a part of Queen's and Birdly's team, the triple truce is still technically in effect. So while Queen, Chris, and Birdly are having their interaction, Queen would also notice that the knight is not with Chris, and to be honest, I think Queen would actually prefer the knight to be lost, considering that she would determine that the knight is the most dangerous in their party. So this would be a massive benefit for her. But after Queen would disappear, and also Birdly as well, Noelle and the knight would return. Now, Noelle would of course create her box disguise, but thanks to the knight would of course decide to poke holes in the box to make it easier for Noelle, so Noelle wouldn't really trip and fall like she would. Now, after that, they would venture on further into the city. Now, there would of course be a few more interactions, but those were smaller, so they would of course encounter way more traffic. Now, the knight would crystal dash through it, but not too far, because seeing how severe the traffic is, I think the knight would help Chris and Noelle get through it. So now, eventually they would reach the second mouse puzzle. Now, they need to get to the other side, because that's where the deactivation switch is. Now, you're supposed to scare Noelle over the force field, but thankfully with the knight would just use their Monarch Wings again to just hop over the force field and land on the button, completely skipping the puzzle. After thankfully skipping the puzzle, they would reach the mouse maze. Now, a mouse maze is just literally a maze of complete cheese. Now, I would assume that one of them would accidentally touch one of the cheeses, and they would start fighting mice. Now, thankfully, with the bravery of the knight, Chris, and the very nervous Noel, they would, of course, spare the mice. Now, eventually, they would reach a dead end. Now, this dead end doesn't seem to have a button on the other side, so the knights cannot just jump over it and skip this one. Now, pretty much, they would see that there is an area below the place that they need to go. So all three of them would make their way down. Now, Noel and the knights would, of course, walk across the platform, but Noel happens to step on a button, and this button would activate the third mouse puzzle. Well, the third, so I believe this is the third and the last mouse puzzle. Now, unfortunately, the platform and the bridge that connected the two, the bridge that connected the two platforms would fall. Now, seeing that the platform is about to fall, the knight would, of course, hop on the back of Noel, and when the platform would fall, the knight would try to use their monarch wings to give them enough height so they can make it onto the other part. Now, unfortunately, the knight is not as big as Noel, but luckily, Chris happens to activate another button, which would dispense mice, which would give them enough height to make it to the other side. Now, this process would continue, but unfortunately, Birdly would come across the tree. Now, Birdly would absolutely not have helped the situation. So while Birdly is boasting about their ego, the knights would get an idea. Now, pretty much, while they are doing this process, the knights realize if Chris could scare Noel with the mice to the other side of the platform, what's stopping them from doing it the other way? Now, the knights would usher Noel on the opposite side and probably near close where the mice would come out, and when Chris would do this, the knights would, of course, bounce themselves and Noel off the platform, and pretty much saving themselves from possibly falling into an unknown city or a worse fate. Now, Birdly would see this, but he would still boast how they did not solve the puzzle, even though they did save Noel. But let's just say by a stroke of luck, one of the mice would so happen to land on the other side and finish the puzzle, which would make the dead end no longer a dead end. Now, Birdly would not be happy about this, but Birdly would, of course, go on his merry way. Now, after all of that, Noel would start to realize that she no longer has a fear of mice, but maybe now a fear of falling. But besides all of that, they would realize that they can now move further on. Now, they would journey, but unfortunately, they would eventually catch up to Birdly. Now, Birdly already seen Noel, but he did not know that Noel was already with them and kind of in their party. Now, Birdly would question this, and Noel would say that she has a treat with Chris and the knight. Now, Birdly would question this, but then he would determine that this truce is not actually a truce, but Chris is forcing Noel to work with them, and Birdly would assume the reason why the knight isn't stopping this is because Chris is teaching the knight how to be a good villain. Now, obviously, none of this is true but Birdly would not really realize or just accept this, maybe yet, but other than that, this would start the second boss battle against Birdly. Now, luckily for Birdly, this isn't Snowgrave, so he's not going to become frozen chicken, but the question is this going to be a pacifist fight, or is this going to be an aggressive fight? Now, knowing how determined Birdly is, I think at this point the knight completely lost patience with him. So even if Chris would warn Birdly about the knight, I don't think Birdly could really react in time to the knight's attacks. So this is going to be a more of a fight battle than really a pacifist one. So the difference between this boss battle and, well, the last one was this, since this is not on a roller coaster, you're not going to really have to bump Birdly off of it. But since this is in Cyber City, and since Birdly is working with Queen, I do believe Queen would give some power to Birdly to command some minions. So because of that, Birdly would be able to summon 2 Werewires to even the playing field. Now, how the fight would go is, since last video, if you've seen it, I did state that the knight is more skilled in combat than Birdly. So since Birdly is summoning 2 Werewires, I believe the knight would mainly focus on Birdly. So Birdly would have his attention solely focused on the knight than Chris or Noelle. But since the knight is dealing with Birdly, that means the Werewires are going to be more focused on Chris and Noelle. So while the knight and Birdly are having their legendary battle, Chris and Noelle is going to have to focus on the Werewires. Now, I do believe that once Chris and Noelle would occasionally free the Plug Boys from the wires, they would all gang up against Birdly. Now, with all this stacked against Birdly, yes, Birdly does have his attacks, but like last time, the knight has their Shade Dash and Sharp Shadow. Yes, Birdly does have his Halberd and Spear attack, but at this point, I think the knight would remember it. So even if Birdly throws all 3 of these against our heroes, he would still be overwhelmed and be defeated. Now, Birdly would be bested, and he would be forced to admit that they have him outnumbered. But since all 3 of them are from the school, Birdly would say that it would be too simple to save Noelle now. Now, unfortunately, well, I guess fortunately, Birdly would also state that the knight seems way too determined on the side of Chris. So, Birdly would, of course, now drop the offer. But Noelle would ask if Birdly is okay now. Birdly would say that he is better than ever, and he is just tired of holding his true potential back. But after that, Birdly would slip away. Now, all 3 of our heroes would continue on. After a short walk, they would all bump into Queen. Now, luckily, Noelle has her disguise in time, so Queen wouldn't realize Noelle was right there, but they would all see that Queen is trying to lure Noelle to her with a battery acid pie. She would see our heroes, but before she could interact them with any further, she would hear Birdly, and she would tell all 3 of them to get in the car so they can hide from Birdly. Now, Birdly is doing the same thing with Queen, but unfortunately, Queen is not interested, so Birdly would still be forced to look for her elsewhere. So as Birdly would try to find Queen again, they would all exit the car. Now, Queen would not recognize Noelle, and she would question this because she doesn't recognize Chris's new friend. But she would say that something about them seems cool and robotic, but she would also tell them that the best bet to find Noelle now is by car. So she would tell all 3 of them to get in the car. Now, they would all drive into the highway of Cyber City. Now, For some unknown reason, Queen thinks it's a good idea to make Chris the driver. And since the knight is with them, Queen put the knight in a booster seat. Now, despite the knight's silent objections, the knight is still going to be put in a booster seat. So, Queen would instruct Chris how to drive and also to dodge the cars. But Chris would also do the most important thing in this section, and that is getting the banana. But after a high-speed car section, they would hit a traffic jam. Now, Queen would send Chris to go deal with this, but she would tell the knight and the disguised Noel to stay because Queen wants to sell them her cool mixtape. Now, Noel would beg Chris to hurry up while the knight is being tortured with this. Now, this would obviously go the same as it would, but I would like to also mention this. This is also where the Spamton interaction would, of course, happen. So, Chris would do all that there, and things would go pretty normal. Now, after a very honest interaction, Chris would make their way to the other side of the traffic jam and would fix traffic. Now, after Queen would fix traffic, she would come and pick up Chris. Now, they would move along and would continue on the highway of Cyber City. Now, as they were making their way, Queen would put on a high beam. Well, she would tell Chris to turn on the high beam so they can find Noel. The Queen would state that once Noel was heated, she would most likely come running straight to Queen, even though it would be the opposite. But other than that, Noel in her disguise would ask Queen why is he so obsessed with Noel. Now, Queen would say that why would she think that? Because, well, the city is obviously dangerous enough because she could possibly either clip into a wall accidentally or, well, run out of potassium. But other than that, Noel in her disguise would ask Queen that is it because she is weak enough to make her into her peon, but Queen would say that it's actually the opposite because she knows that Noel is far more stronger and actually has much more potential than, well, most of the others that Queen had seen. But before they could take this conversation any further, she would tell everyone to get out of the car because the car suspiciously hasn't, well, exploded yet. But once they would all get out, the car would explode, and Queen would say that was a close one. After all four of them were almost destroyed along with the car, Queen would say that their best bet of finding Noel now is by splitting up on foot. Now, Queen would suggest that maybe either Chris or Chris's friend would go with her, but seeing that all three of them are not really wanting to, well, potentially give up Noel, they would say that it would probably better for all three of them to stick together, while Queen would go along on herself. Now, would Queen find this a suspicious? I want to say a little bit, but then again, Queen is, well, the ruler of this dark world, so she wouldn't really have any trouble going along by herself. So Queen would say if Noel needs proof of her opinions, give her her mixtape. But other than that, Queen would go along. But Queen would not forget about that part. Now, once Queen would disappear, Noel would take off her disguise and would be relieved that Queen is gone. Now, Noel would say that she has a feeling that they are almost out of this situation, well, and almost out of here in general. So, all three of them would make their way down into the next puzzle. Now, seeing that this puzzle is going to require 2 people to complete, the knight would go on the other side, but Noelle would volunteer to do that to save the knight some trouble, because after all, Noelle does kinda owe the knight for saving her life on the last puzzle, so it's the least that Noelle could do. Now, as Chris and Noelle would solve the puzzle with the knight behind them, Noelle would, of course, start having a nostalgic talk with Chris. Now, while the two would talk about how they were little and how they hanged out with their older siblings and also explored with them, Noelle would also bring up that it would be nice to do that again, but she has also seen that Toriel did bring the knights into school. Now, Noelle would wonder if Chris has any relation to the knight, like, is the knight a part of his family, like a distant relative, or is there something else? Now, the best explanation that Chris would think of is, I want to say that Chris would say that the knight is a foreign exchange student that is staying with his family until possibly the end of the school year. Now, Noelle would buy this because, well, it seems realistic and reasonable, but other than that, the conversation would pretty much go normal from there in this section. But other than that, the knight would silently follow the two as they would nostalgically talk about how they were younger once. But after that, they would make it out of the puzzle. Now, after they would make it out, they would reach a carnival section of the city. Now, they would see that a lot of the booths are just a ball throwing game. But eventually, they would see Queen. Now, Noelle would put on her disguise, but also enter one of the booths, leaving the knight and Chris out in the open in Queen's sight. Now, Queen would go up to the two and tell them to check this out, and she would pretty much score a perfect throw and would pretty much just play the ball game and just knock down all the milk bottles. Now, pretty much he would go up to Noelle in disguise and ask for a prize. Now, Noelle was not wanting Queen to realize by her accidentally stalling, so Noelle would go underneath the booth and would just grab whatever looked prize looking enough. Now, Noelle would hand Queen a gift box. Now, Queen would take it and she would say, cool. Now, but before she would leave, she would say that she doesn't really actually want this, so she would give the gift box to Chris. Now, after Chris would receive the prize and Queen disappearing, Susie and Rosse would finally catch up to Chris and the knight. Now, unlike Chris and the knight, Rosse and Susie would seem to have had a far better time on their own adventure. Now, what have they done while they were separated from Chris and the knight? I don't know, but Susie would reveal that she had slightly learned healing magic by thinking it's an attack. Now, unfortunately, Susie's magic is not as powerful as Rosse's yet. But then again, Rosse and Susie would ask, who's the gift box for? Now, Chris would have a few options. They could either give it to themselves, Noelle, Rosse, Susie, or the knight. Now, and also Birdie, but Chris would say that the prize is for the knight. Now, Chris would give the prize box to the knight, but the knight would just look at it and would pretty much have no idea what to do with it. So, Unfortunately, no one would get to see what's in the box. But after that, Noelle would come out of hiding. As Noelle would reveal herself, she would come out of hiding. Now, Susie would question, wasn't Noelle on Queen's side, but she would, but before Noelle could explain, she would be flustered at the sight of Susie. Now, luckily, Chris was there to help her out, and Chris would explain that they have a truce. Now, Susie would be happy that Noelle would join the party, and well, she didn't really want to kill Noelle anyways. So, but besides that, Noelle would join the party. Now, Rose would possibly ask if the knight would want to give Noelle a charm, but knowing that the knight has already given away 3 charms, and one of them were very expensive, the knight isn't willing to lend out a 4th. So, after that, they would make their way towards the Dark Fountain. Now, pretty much the next section is just going up. Well, I'm going to skim past the next section pretty quickly. So once they would reach up to, well, the skylining of, well, the upper parts of the city, they would start to see that this is another large puzzle segment. So pretty much, there is a minor puzzle for, well, on the platform, but since the knight has monarch wings, the knight would save the fun gang a lot of effort, which would have not been worth it. So after that, they would complete the mouse balloon puzzle. Now, pretty much, they will make it past the first 2 or 3, but then they would realize one of the puzzles require 20 mouse. Well, 20 mice. So, as Susie would get frustrated, Noelle would suggest that they should split up the work. Now, as they would split up the work, they would, so Susie and, well, actually, Noelle would explain this, but since the knight has monarch wings and, well, has a good jump, Noelle would just release the mice, and the knight would cut them down, so Chris can catch all 20 of them. And like that, they would get all 20 mice. Now, after they would release the mice, they would of course move on forward, and eventually they would reach Queen's palace. Now, Noelle would ask, do they really have to go into the den of the beast, and so they could just get to the Dark Fountain. And unfortunately, Susie would say that it's pretty much the only way so they can get to the Dark Fountain. Now, as they would move forward, they would be stopped by Queen. Now, Queen has been waiting for all of our heroes, and seeing that Chris and the knight have Noelle, and along with the others, Queen would say that the truce is now over, and because of that, she would demand that Noelle should come to her. Now, Noelle would refuse to do this, but Queen would say that if Noelle would not join her, a certain bird would take a bath in the acid pool, and Noelle, obviously being the kind-hearted reindeer, she could not dare imagine what would happen if she would allow this to happen. So, unfortunately, Noelle would reluctantly go with Queen. Now, once Noelle would reach Queen and unfortunately rejoin her, Birdly would appear. Now, all of our heroes would be surprised because Queen pretty much made it seem that she already had Birdly. He would be surprised to see Noelle, but Birdly would be happy because, well, that means that their plans with Queen would continue as normal. But unfortunately, this is where Queen would betray Birdly as well. Birdly would question about everything that Queen promised Birdly, but Queen would reveal that she only agreed to all of that and told everything that he wanted to hear because Birdly was could be easily manipulated. And Bertie would also ask about what about being a gamer, and Queen would deliver a gut-punching truth. She is a mobile gamer. Now, pretty much because of this, Queen would capture Chris, Susie, Bertie, and Noelle, and she would summon 2 of her minions to restrain Roche and carry them away. Now, Queen would realize that solely capturing the knight wouldn't really be a good idea, because either the knight could use their shade dash to move through the object, or the knight would possibly just willingly be captured so they can be taken into the heart of Queen's palace, which would not be a good idea. So Queen would decide that the best way to stop the knight would be to delay them as much as possible. So pretty much Queen would summon a few of her minions, probably just maybe some were-wires, to fight the knight, while Queen would take the rest of the captured heroes into her palace. Now, obviously the knights would defeat the enemies, and the knights would see that they are now alone. Now, Queen would put her entire palace on lockdown, and because of that, the knight is now facing Queen's entire army and pretty much herself alone. Now, the knight is going to have to rescue all of the rest of the heroes and also make their way to the Dark Fountain to stop Queen. Now, this is where we are going to leave this video, because hopefully the next part would be the finale to chapter 2. If not, most definitely the one after that, but we will have to see. Now, just like last video, I have to mention I do not own Deltarune or Hollowknight. They belong to their respected creators, and that goes for the same with the music. Now, if you like this video, you are more than welcome to subscribe and like. But if you're here for the ride, that is more than you are more than welcome to stay. Now, and of course, this video is Captain Bones approved. What if the knight was in Deltarune Chapter 2, Part 3? Now, this should be the finale of Chapter 2, hopefully. But, other than that, where did we leave off? So, last time we left off, Queen had captured Chris and the rest of the gang, but she had left the knight alone. Now, pretty much the reason why Queen captured all of the rest of the heroes and instead of the knights was because no restraint could technically hold the knights thanks to their shaded cloak and to their abilities. Now, because of that, Queen thought the best possible way that her plans can succeed from now is if she were to capture the heroes and pretty much completely stall the knight as long as possible. So Queen is going to have to harass the knight as much as possible until her plans are ready. But other than that, we return to the knight. Now, the knight is standing alone outside of Queen's palace and wondering how are they going to rescue the heroes. Now, seeing the design of Queen's mansion, I could assume that there are multiple entry points where the knight could break in. But, unfortunately for the knight doesn't know where Queen is keeping our heroes, so the knight is going to have to snoop around the palace. Now, here's how I think the knight is going to break in. So, if you'd played Chapter 2, you'd obviously remember the acid tunnels. Now, the acid tunnels obviously have acid, and acid is a liquid. Now, the point I'm trying to get to that is, since there is a massive amount of acid in Queen's palace, how did it get in there? Now, I am going to assume that there is either a aqueduct or some other pipeline that leads into Queen's Mansion to get the acid in and out. So let's say by a stroke of luck, the knights would find a entry point into the pipelines. Now, if you'd played Hollow Knight, you'd remember that the knight has one item that would help him, and that item is Isma's Tear. Now, Isma's Tear is pretty much gives the knights immunity towards acid. Now, obviously the acid in the waterways and in Hollowness are very different types of acid than the acid in Queen's Mansion, but it's never really specified the limitations of the knight's immunity towards the acid. So let's just say that the knight can just swim through any type of acid. So after some snooping around and a lot of trespassing, the knights managed to sneak their way into the acid pipeline and eventually enter Queen's acid pool. Now, the knights would, of course, try and get a sense of direction in the acid pool, but after enough swimming, the knights would encounter Rosecard. Now, Rose would be rehearsing his ambush and pretty much his next confrontation against the heroes, but the knights would, of course, stand there until Rose would see the knight. Now, Rose wasn't expecting the knight to encounter them so soon, let alone literally be swimming in acid. Now, Rose would pretty much give his villainous monologue, but knowing the situation the knight is in, the knight wouldn't really have time for Rose, so the knight would attack Rose mid-dialogue and knocking Rose into the acid. Now, Rose would of course be burning in agony, so Rose would of course probably teleport out of there, and because of this, it pretty much prevents Rose from encountering Chris and Rose during when they had to go through the tunnel. So thankfully that the knight's action would allow Chris and Rose to completely skip that encounter. So pretty much while the knight is swimming through the tunnels, obviously things would go the same on the fun games side. So pretty much Chris and the gang are pretty much having Birdie's character development, but so that's kind of what they are doing over there. But after finding the exit to the acid swimming pool, Queen would finally notice that the knight somehow broken in. Now, Queen really not wanting the knight to ruin her plans, Queen would alert all of her minions to find the knight and capture them, and either pretty much do whatever. Now, I don't know what Queen would do if she would capture the knight, but I would like to assume that she would probably just put him under lock and key and throw the key away somewhere. But besides that, Queen would see that the knight somehow broken into her palace, and because of that, Queen would mostly focus all of her attention on the knight, but she would also keep tabs on Chris and the others. So pretty much the moment Queen would sound the alarm, almost every SWAT-ling and any other servants of Queen would pretty much be heading directly in the knight's direction, which is pretty much every direction. Now, here's what's going to happen. So, the knight does not know where Chris and the others are at, and pretty much, I would assume by this point, Chris and the others have already escaped their holding rooms. So, pretty much, all the knights could know is that probably Chris and the others are probably getting tortured for all that the knight knows. So, because of that, the knight is going to stop holding back. So, I would like to assume that almost throughout the entire adventure, the knight has been putting effort in their fights, but they have also probably been sort of holding back. But seeing that the knight is kind of on a time schedule, the knight would begin fighting through Queen's minions like they're in the Trial of the Fool. So pretty much, this would be a good thing and also a bad thing. Now the good thing is, the noise and commotion of this would pretty much spread, well, the news in general of the Knight's Rampage would spread through the palace. It would probably reach the funding. But the bad news is this would force Queen to put her plans ahead of schedule. So this means that they're going to have to rescue Noelle right now. So, but other than that, eventually the news of the Knight's Rampage would reach Chris, Rose, and Susie, and probably Birdly. Now they would have to decide whether they want to find Noelle first or try and find the Knight. Now, knowing how the Knight can really well handle themselves, they decide that finding Noelle first would be the more important part. So while Chris and the others would try and find Noelle and also rescue her, the Knights would, of course, be fighting the gauntlets of Queen's Mansion. Now, Queen would, of course, be monitoring how the Knight fights and pretty much the Knight's actions in general, because if the scenario where Queen is going to have to actually face the Knights and the others directly, which is a very high probability, she is going to at least need something up her sleeve to try and level her, well, try to level the playing field to fight the Knight. Now, pretty much, the Knights would, of course, enter the dining hall and pretty much fight their way through it as well. Now, eventually, after a few and many turns, the Knights would re-encounter Rose and Susie, who are standing outside of a door. And now this is where I'm going to say that while the Knights was probably entering the mansion, or well, fighting through Queen's minions, Chris had taken that time to continue the Spamton side quest. Now, pretty much, I'm going to say that Chris has gotten the key gen by this point, and pretty much starting the final interaction with Spamton down in the basement. Now, pretty much, Rose and Susie would be happy to see the Knight, but Rose wouldn't be too pleased on the Knight's methods of trying to find them. But while the three were getting together again, they would hear the noise of swatchlings coming in their direction. Now, they would make the smart decision to go down into the basement to, well, not be seen by the horde of swatchlings and other minions that are being sent by Queen to find the group and the Knight. Now, pretty much, while the three would make their way down into the basement, Spamton would be giving his monologue about how, in order to be big, Spamton is going to need Chris's soul. But before Spamton could do anything funny towards Chris, Susie would hit Spamton with a vicious Root Buster. After hitting Spamton with a Root Buster, Susie would go up to Chris to see if they're alright. Now, Susie would ask them who was that weirdo, but before Chris could answer, all three of them would be swept up by carts and be sent down a suspiciously long track. Now, the Knights would of course be in Chris's cart, but they would be taken by another surprise, and that would be the floating hedge of Spamton. Now, luckily, the Knight has Vengeful Spirits. Now, Vengeful Spirits I'm going to say that it is strong enough to destroy the hedge, but Chris would still have their yellow soul. Now, Spamton would be surprised to see that not only one, but two big shots, and just like that, the Spamton Neo fight would begin. Now, Spamton Neo is pretty much like the Jubble fight. It's not mandatory, but it does have a good reward. But pretty much, this is the first major fight of this video. So, just like every other major fight, we are going to have to compare the knights against Spamton. Now, pretty much, in order to defeat Spamton, you can either fight Spamton or just cut their strings. Now, I'm gonna say due to the environment of the battlefield, I'm gonna say unfortunately the knight is going to have to go on the pacifist route. So they're all going to have to cut the strings off of Spamton. Now, remember way back in chapter 1 when I said that there was a reason why I gave Chris Market Pride? This fight would be that reason. Now, seeing that they are riding carts and they're above a very moving track, the knight cannot just go off the cart and just go up to Spamton. So, for this fight, the knight is going to have to rely on the teamwork with Chris, Suzy, and Ralsei. So, pretty much, the knight does have vengeful spirit to destroy the Spamton hits, but unfortunately, the knight has to have soul to cast magic. So, and unfortunately, the knight doesn't really have Spell Twister, but the knight does also have the Shaman Stones and all the other magic charms if they want to go down the violent route. But just like I said, they are going to have to cut off the strings. Now, pretty much, Spamton has the environmental advantage because of the moving tracks, but mainly most of Spamton's attacks pretty much require the yellow soul, because there's the heart attack. Well, the heart attack. No, the pun not intended. But pretty much cutting the strings. Now, there is the Great Slash, which is, I think, one of the nail arts, but then again, I could be forgetting the name wrong. But yeah, that would be one thing that the knight can do against Spamton. Now, but yet again, thanks to the fight really mainly taking place on tracks, and I don't think that if the knight would land on the tracks would be a very good idea of fighting Spamton. But pretty much, the knight is just going to be a hit and dodge, and mostly dodging the entire fight. Now, there is also Giga Spamton, which is, I think, Spamton's final attack. But pretty much, from what I've seen, that's mostly just for show, and other than that, that's pretty much Spamton's final attack. Now, there is a whole lot of other attacks, but pretty much those attacks can be dealt with the yellow soul. So, but besides that, all the knight can really do in that fight is either just dodge Spamton's attacks and occasionally hit Spamton with a spell and just slash through Spamton's wires. But pretty much, the fun game is going to be mainly the leaders during that fight. So, in comparison, mainly just because of the environment, Spamton, Neo, and the Knight are kinda on equal ground. But without the environment, I'm sure the Knight could probably beat Spamton alone if it didn't really take place on moving tracks. But other than that, the fight would pretty much go how it would usually go, just with the inclusion of the Knights and their abilities. But eventually, with enough effort, the Knights and the Fun Gang would cut through pretty much all of Spamton's wire until Spamton only has one left. Now, pretty much the same thing would happen. They would all cut the last wire and Spamton would collapse on the ground. Now, Spamton's dialogue would still be the same. So, Spamton would say how he just wanted to be free, and he would dissolve into the deal maker. After receiving the deal maker, they would all try to, well, they would all move to exit the basement. Now, right before they would exit the basement, Susie would stop all of them by asking, are they seriously not going to talk about what just happened? Now, Rouse would try to find a reason to why this happened, and Rouse would probably assume that Spamton was just a corrupted program. Now, Susie could see this, but Susie also has a feeling that that really might not be why it happened. But while Susie would think this, she would go over to Chris, and she would see that Chris has goosebumps. Now, she would ask Chris if they are okay. Now, Chris would say that they are okay, but their voice says otherwise. Now, pretty much, Susie would say that if something like this would probably happen again, it would be better if they would all handle it as a team next time. Now, the Knight wasn't really here for, well, the rest of the Spamton side quest because, well, they're moving through the palace, but pretty much this would only add more suspicion onto Chris towards the Knight. Now, the Knight doesn't mind helping Chris, but at the same time, it's kind of starting to get harder for the Knight to entirely trust Chris because of, well, things like this, and also, well, the last time. But other than that, the Knights would just focus on the goal, then, well, entirely think about this for right now. So they would all agree to work as a team for whatever comes next, and they would exit the basement. Now, as they would exit the basement, luckily, the search party for the Knights and for the Fun Gang would have left the area by that point. Now, they would all move to actually find Noel now. But after respecting some pottery and some organization, they would eventually reach Birdley. Now, Birdley would reveal a passageway that would lead towards Noel, but Birdley would say that it would probably be a better idea if some of them would distract Queen and the rest of them would go rescue Noel. Now, Birdley, Susie are a group of 2, but since they are going with Noel, that would make a group of 3. Now, since Chris and Rouse are going to help distract Queen, that means I'm going to throw the Knight with Chris and Rouse to make them a group of 3. Now, since they are going to distract Queen, and since the Knights, well, rampage earlier, it would be a perfect distraction. Now, as Chris and Rouse would enter the swimming pool of acid, they would get into the swan boats. But unfortunately, the swan boats only have room for 2. Now, Rouse would suggest that maybe there is a bigger swan boat, but before Rouse could say anything else, the Knight would just jump in the acid, completely unharmed. Now, Rouse would be surprised and also shocked by this, but after some time, Rouse would see that the Knight doesn't look like they're in pain, so Rouse would be relieved. Now, pretty much how this section would go is Queen would, of course, be very distracted by this. And pretty much, the knight would just be hanging on the back of the swan boat while Chris and Rose would have their character development. Now, since the knight has Isma's tear, Chris and Rose wouldn't really have to deal with the puzzles because the knight can just directly swim through the houses and pretty much just solve the puzzles themselves to, so they can continue on. Now, but besides that, Chris and Rose and the knight will just breeze past through the acid tunnel because the knight also dealt with Rose earlier, so Rose is kind of in no condition to at least try to have a boss battle against Chris and Rose and the knight. So because of that, the Rose encounter wouldn't really happen. Now, eventually, they would reach the end of the tunnel ride. Now, after Chris and Rose would get their photo, and the knight very barely in the photo, with just their horns in it, they would reach the end of the tunnel. And now they shall wait. And now they are waiting for Chris. No, now they are waiting for Susie and Burley to come back with Noelle. But pretty much, while the three are a man closing their eyes and the knight just looking down, they would just imagine what Susie is probably doing. Now, pretty much the same thing is going to happen as it does with, well, on Susie's side. Susie would be able to convince Noelle that this is a dream, but when they're on the Ferris wheel, and thanks to last video, Noelle would be kind of scared because now she's scared of heights now instead of mice. But pretty much she would be a bit calm because, well, Susie's here. But pretty much Susie and Noelle would have their character development up until Burley comes and ruins the moment, while Noelle would choke Burley out. But eventually, Susie would return with, not with Noelle now, but pretty much Susie would rejoin the group while also landing on Rose in the process. But other than that, they can now go and confront Queen after, well, as they would fight through Queen's minions, well, pretty much the last of Queen's minions, and they would eventually reach Queen. Now, Queen would be there waiting for them. Now, Queen would give her monologue about it, with Noelle now in her possession. It's only a matter of time before Noelle's will would eventually align with Queen's, but Susie would say that they have rescued Noelle and there's no chance of Queen winning now. But Queen would reveal that after Susie left Noelle with Burley, she had sent some of her minions to capture Burley and reclaim Noelle. Now, as Queen would reveal this, Burley would descend down from the ceiling, I would assume, now being controlled by a wire. Now pretty much Queen would give our heroes one last chance to surrender and or join her or pretty much be enslaved by her. But of course our heroes would oppose Queen, and now because of that, the battle against Queen would begin. Now, this is technically the final boss, but like I said, technically it is, but besides that, in order to defeat Queen, well, Queen has Burley under her control, and she also has a shield. So, how I see this fight going is pretty much, they need to fight, well, they need to disable Queen sealed, but also they also need to free Birdly. So Chris with Mark of Pride would mainly deal with Birdly, while Susie and the Knight would try to defeat Queen. Now, Rose would hang back with their magic, and pretty much they shall just pretty much be magical support for our heroes. Now, luckily, this is pretty much why I gave them charms, because not only just for plot convenience, but also to give them more of an edge to certain fights like this one. Now, pretty much, I don't think that they would be very pacifistic in this fight, mainly, but pretty much, once they would disable Queen sealed, Susie with heavy blow, well, no, not heavy blow, Susie with unbreakable strength, and the Knight with whatever charm mode would fit them for this battle, would pretty much unleash all their strength upon Queen. Now, Queen, seeing how the Knight has fought their way through her palace, she would pretty much try to predict the Knight's movement as best as possible. So some of the Knight's attacks would land on her and some won't, but other than that, Queen would be overwhelmed until her shield would return. Now with Mark of Pride and Chris would be trying to loosen the wire, but since the wire isn't willingly going to come off, Chris decides that the best way to free Birdly is to cut the wire off. Now, eventually, Queen's shield would be growing, so in order for them to properly disable it without, well, actually, they're not going to need a toast. The Knight is just going to bypass the shield with Susie trying to break through it as well. So pretty much, the Knight is going to be harassing Queen while Susie is going to be behind the Knight supporting them. So how the fight would pretty much go is, while Queen is throwing all of her attacks and Chris freeing Birdly, they're just going to pretty much brute force their way through this fight. Now, Queen, seeing that Chris eventually freed Birdly, and now she is significantly outnumbered, Queen would pull one final trick to escape our heroes, and that is the oldest trick in the book, which is making them look in the other direction. Now, this trick would work with every hero except the Knight. So as Queen would make her escape, the Knight would be right on her tail. Now, the rest of the heroes would be making sure Birdly is okay, but with Birdly trying to get Susie to fall in love with him, which wouldn't work, but pretty much Birdly would just tell them to go after Queen. Now, all of our heroes would eventually catch up to the Knight, and they would all eventually catch up to Queen. Would find Queen overlooking the city. Now, Queen would explain about the Knight and how the Knight had cursed their will into their blackened blade. Now, pretty much, and how the Knight managed to create this world. But unfortunately, Cyberworld is locked in and only trapped in the confines of the library. Now, she would say that if one was determined enough, they could create more dark fountains, and eventually they could cover the whole world. Now, Queen would finish her monologue, and she would ask Noel how that would sound. But before Queen could say anything further, Susie would hit Queen with a Root Buster and pretty much free Noel. Now, Noelle would be happy, but she would warn that Queen has something much bigger. And before they could do anything else, Queen would reappear with a giant robot of herself. Now, Noelle would say that they cannot defeat Queen like this, but the Knight is not backing down because the Knight has fought things bigger than him before. So the Knight would strike the challenge pose, but before the Knight could do anything else, Queen would flick the Knight right off the roof of her palace, and probably would either break 3 masks. Now, as the rest of the heroes would watch the Knight fall, they would turn back to say that Queen will not get away with this. But unfortunately, Queen would do the same thing to them and knock them off of the platform on the palace. So pretty much now all 4 of them are pretty much falling to their death. Now, as they were trying to figure out how they're going to get out of the situation, all 4 of them would be saved by Birdly and his flying carts. Now, Birdly would reveal that if they were to combine their powers, they can defeat Queen, and the rest of the heroes would see multiple other Darkners and citizens of Cyber City. Now, here's the thing, right? Half of the Darkners are willing to stand up against Queen because they don't like the role. And then there's the other half who decides that it's better, if they cannot beat our heroes, they might as well join them because it's better to stand up against Queen than, well, stand up against the heroes and especially the Knights. So they would side with our heroes. Now, luckily, Rose card is also here because, well, same reason with the other half, can't beat them, join them, but so Rose is now completely covered in bandages, but other than that, Rose also has brought the trash machine with him. Now, because of this, everyone would combine their powers into one, and they would form the Ultimate School Project. Now, what powers would the Knights give the project? Now, with some thinking, I have decided to give the project the Knight's Shade ability. So, with powers combined, they would form the Roaring Chorus. Now, pretty much, Queen will be waiting in the middle of the city for our heroes for the very final confrontation. Now, pretty much, this battle will just be like the arcade machine, but with giant robots this time, and actually real. So pretty much, the 2 Colossus would engage in a hand-to-hand combat, but of course, Queen is not one for honest fights, so she would throw in a lot of curveballs, but thanks to the Knight's Shade Dash, our heroes would be able to use the Knight's Shade abilities to dodge Queen's tricks. So pretty much, Queen can only resort to hand-to-hand combat against our heroes. Now, so pretty much, after a long and decent epic fight, Queen would begin to lose, and in a very last-ditch effort, she would jump in the air and reveal that she has detachable hands. And because of that, she would defeat the Roaring Chorus and capture all 4 of our heroes. So after a bit, Queen would return to Noelle. Queen would be holding all 4 of our heroes in her gigantic palm. Now, Queen, with the last bit of energy that she has in her mech, she would instruct Noelle to take the pin that Queen has given her and to strike the earth. Now, Noelle would be hesitant, but after the entire time and through this entire adventure, she finally builds up the courage to stand up to Queen. Now, Noelle would tell Queen to leave her friends alone and would tell Queen that all of this is not making her happy, and especially right now it's not really working. Now, after Noelle would stand up against Queen, well, vocally against Queen, Queen would take a moment and she would smile. Now, she would explain that all she wanted to do is to make Noelle happy. Now, pretty much, Queen would just tell Noelle that with the power she has, choose the world and create the world that she would want. And make the world that would make her happy. And with that, Queen would shut down. So pretty much, as Queen was shut down, Noelle would contemplate the words that Queen had told her. Now, Noelle didn't want to live in a world that was ruled by Queen, but if that wasn't the case, would this world be really bad, or would it be better? But Noelle would ask Susie this too. Now, the conversation would go the same, but eventually Birdly would return. Now, how did Birdly escape the battle between the Chorus and Giga Queen? I don't know, but Birdly is here. Now, Birdly would say that he can assist in creating this world and assisting in creating this world that Noelle and Susie wants. Now, pretty much Birdly would raise his halberd and say with his power he shall create a new world. But before Birdly could do this, Roche would stop him mid-track. Now, Birdly would say that he was just trying to help, and Birdly would try again, but Roche would shout to stop. Now, Roche would explain why this would be a bad idea, because Roche would pretty much explain the roaring. Now, the roaring is pretty much when the balance between the light and the dark is broken, and pretty much mainly happens when the balance between the light and the dark is broken, and when there's too many dark fountains, it would practically lead to the apocalypse. So, Roche would ask, is that their idea of paradise? And now, Queen had a backup power, and she would say, well, she didn't know that. Now, they would all be surprised that Queen didn't notice, and they would ask, isn't that what you wanted? Now, Queen would reveal that the entire time she was just going off of complete assumption and theory, and pretty much she was going off of basically what the knight has done. Now, with all of that, Queen would release our heroes and she would return. As Queen is exiting her mech, it would just leave our heroes and Noelle and Birdly. So pretty much the same thing would happen as it really does. Noelle and Susie would pretty much have the same conversation, and Susie would say that Noelle's dream is going to end soon, and she would also tell Noelle that she does not have a tail. Then, as they would continue on, Queen would run her goodbye.exe, or I think that's what it's called, but anyway, she would be thanking our heroes for everything that they've done, even though Queen has not been a help. But anyways, Queen will remember them for their unneeded honesty, their fullest bravery, and their chill vibes. And Queen would also remember the knight for their primal aggression. Now, Roche would say that this doesn't have to be a goodbye, because they can all just bring them to Castletown. Now, Queen hearing this, she would be like, oh, really cool. So she would just cancel the program, and she would allow our heroes to seal the Dark Fountain. So, but before our heroes would seal the Dark Fountain, the knight would go up to them, and the knight would take back the charms that the knight has given them at the beginning of this adventure. Now, once their charms were removed, they would feel like their normal selves. So Susie would feel less stronger. Chris's sword would be returned to a normal broadsword, And Rosse's magic would return to, well, the normal price, well, the normal amount of TP that they needed to cast. So pretty much, once the knights would retake their charms, Susie would say, well, it was good while it lasted, I guess. But after that, Rose would hang back while Chris, Susie, and the knights would go up to the fountain to seal it. Now, just like before, Chris would go up to the fountain, and with the power of their soul, they would seal the dark fountain. And with their bright flash of light, the library was just as normal. So all three of them would stand there while they would see Noelle and Birdley face down on the computers. Well, not on the computers, but on the computer desks. After a bit, Noelle and Birdley would regain their consciousness, and now, after looking around for a bit, Noelle would realize that this could have actually been a dream now. Even though none of it was a dream, but thanks to Susie, Noelle would actually believe it was a dream. Now, Birdley would also believe it was a dream, and they would see Chris, Susie, and the knight. Now, Birdley would ask what are they doing here, but Noelle would say that she invited Chris and Susie to study together while the knight would probably hang around with them. Now, Birdley would be opposed to this, but after everything, well, I guess after the dream, Birdley would say, well, we could try it, but unfortunately, they would realize that the day is about to end. Now, unfortunate, and because of that, Noelle and Birdley would, of course, exit the computer lab and go to wherever they need. So, after all of that, Susie would take a minute and she would realize that they practically just saved the world. But she would also realize that also nobody knows that, so pretty much they figured that the next best course of action would be to return to Castletown. Now, they would exit the library and they would pretty much go around hometown, either interacting with the people there or just looking around in general. But after all the interactions, they would eventually make it to the school and they would enter the closet and they would jump down into Castletown. Now, as they would enter Castletown, the glimmer of light would come off Chris, which would signify that Queen is now in Castletown. But there would be a second glimmer of light, and that glimmer of light would come off of the knight. Now, they wouldn't notice the second one, or maybe they would also look over Queen as well. But once they would land in the entrance of Castletown, they would be greeted by Queen. Now, Queen would look around in this new dark world, and she would tell them that this place seems cool enough. So as they would all venture further into Castletown, they would be greeted by a second figure, and the knights would stop dead in their tracks because they are seeing a ghost of their past, and that ghost is the Pale King. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why is the Pale King here? Because doesn't this video say, what if the knight was in well, not in Hollow Knight, what if the knight was in Deltarune? Now, here's the thing, right? Now, from my understanding of the Dark World, and mainly from Rossi's explanation, and from some of the lore of Hollow Knight, I decided that this is where I could be able to intertwine the lore of Hollow Knight and Deltarune together, because that is also a goal of this what if. Now, the second thing is, how did the Pale King get here? So, from my understanding of the Dark World is, when an item enters a Dark World from the Light World, that item would, of course, become their own being. Now, the reason now, if you don't know the lore of Hollow Knight, which I'm assuming some of you do not, the Pale King is technically not alive. Now, how did the Pale King die? Well, that is still kind of a mystery on my knowledge. Some people assume that the Pale King withered away along with his powers, and others believe that the Pale King was consumed by the void and by his own actions. But whatever the case, the Pale King is in the state that they are. So pretty much because of that, that still technically doesn't answer the question of how the Pale King is here. Now, if you play Hollow Knight, there is a certain charm, and that charm is called King Soul. Now, the King Soul is a charm that needs to be assembled, unlike every other charm that you come across. Now, there are other certain charms that can be upgraded, but the King Soul is one of the real important charms if you're going for a specific ending. But the King Soul was created by the White Lady and also by the Pale King, because the King Soul represents the union of the two. In other words, it's a magical wedding ring with a few extra steps. Now, the King Soul is, of course, has a part of the Pale King and also has his soul in it. Now, pretty much, if you'd seen the knight's charm inventory, you'd obviously see that the King Soul is missing. Well, if you take a closer look at the Void Heart, you can see that is the King Soul. Just the Void Heart is a upgraded version of the King Soul, and it's pretty much the knight's rejecting the Pale King's will. Now, so I'm going to stretch the lore of both Deltarune and Hollow Knight by saying that even though the knights and most of their items and all of their charms are practically immune to the influence of the Dark World by some unknown force, I'm going to say that since the Void Heart is pretty much rejecting the Pale King's will, I believe that the Dark World would be able to gain its grasp around the Pale King's soul, and mainly all the Pale King parts of the Void Heart, therefore resurrecting him. Now, the thing about the Pale King is, from my understanding and re-educating myself about him, is that the Pale King is a higher being. And to explain that for the non-Hollow Knight people, a higher being is a god, just in all lowercase, sometimes with a capital G, but most of the time they're all in lowercase. But pretty much the Pale King is a higher being, but since they're in the Dark World, most of his godlike abilities have been stripped away, but he's still not completely powerless. So, in case if any in the future chapters, we are going to see combat either in Castle Town, we're going to say that the Pale King would have most of the Pure Vessel's abilities and also Monarch Wings. But other than that, that's pretty much all the power that the Pale King has. Now, besides the Pale King's powers, who is the Pale King? Now, from my understanding and from everything that I gathered, the Pale King is pretty much in the morally gray area. The Pale King started out as a good person, but when the Radiance started returning and that whole scenario, that's when I believe the Pale King started to go way downhill. So other than that, the Pale King in this what if would be in a gray area in this what if. But other than that, they would see the Pale King. Now, the Pale King is also the creator of the vessels, which, if you know how that went, you obviously know that the Knight isn't really on good terms with the Pale King. And I don't think the Pale King would even know who the Knight is. Maybe they would, except for them being a vessel. Now, Chris and Susie would be surprised as well to see the Pale King, but they wouldn't be as surprised as the Knight. Now, Susie would ask who the Pale King is, but the Pale King would also ask a similar question by saying, what are you, and also wondering where he is. Now, pretty much the conversation between the Delta Warriors and also the Pale King would just be a conversation of complete confusion. Now, eventually, Rouse would come into the picture. Now, Rouse would return to greet our heroes on the return to Castletown and to also get Queen and all of her darkeners that came over from Cyberworld. But Rouse would also be surprised to see the Pale King because Rouse never really encountered the Pale King throughout Cyberworld, but Rouse would just come to the conclusion that that's where the Pale King probably came from. Now, the Pale King would be hearing all of this, but all of this would just add to the Pale King's confusion, where he would just say, "Can anyone just explain what's going on?" Now, Rouse would ask the Pale King what he is confused about. Now, the Pale King would tell Rouse about everything he's confused by. So, pretty much, Rouse would ask, "Is the Pale King a lightener?" And the Pale King would ask, "What is a lightener anyways?" So, Rouse would just go to our heroes for some sort of explanation. Now, Susie and Chris would have no idea and pretty much have no answer for Rouse, but Rouse would see that the Knight does know something about the Pale King. But unfortunately, just like other times, the Knight was unable to precisely communicate this with Rouse. Now, the one familiar sight that the King would see is, of course, the Knight. Now, the Knight would see the Knight and would think, since there is a vessel here, that means he must be somewhere either near Hollowness or somewhere in the world of Hollow Knight. So, the Pale King would ask if anyone knows about Hollowness, and they would all in unison would say no. Now, pretty much the Pale King would, well, not the Pale King, so Rouse would, seeing that the Pale King doesn't know anything about the Dark World, or anybody knowing anything about the Pale King except the Knight's physical expressions, would mean that Rouse would decide to take Queen and King to his castle so he can figure it out. So pretty much because of this, Rouse wouldn't really be able to join our heroes in Castletown for the aftermath of Chapter 2. So after Rouse would take Queen and King away, Chris and Susie and the Knight would be left to themselves. Now, Susie would ask the Knight about the Pale King and if they're okay, because they didn't seem physically and visibly okay about the Pale King. Now, the Knight would try to express their concerns as best as they could, but just like always, it wouldn't really land. So after all of that, they decide to take the confusion off and, well, that whole scenario away by adventuring through Castle Town. Now, pretty much, they would not go back to Rousey's castle because they don't want to, because they believe that Rousey would figure it out himself. So they would just venture around the town. Now, they would do all of the post Chapter 2 interactions. Well, the post-adventure interactions, I should say. But we're going to cover Sean's the Shadow Crystal interaction. So pretty much they would all return to Sean's shop. Now Sean would greet our heroes, but he would see that the prince is not with them. So he would ask our heroes about it. Now they would tell Sean that Rousey is dealing with something important, so he couldn't be with them. Now Sean would understand this, and he would ask, what can he do for our heroes? So they would probably buy more items, but they would give Sean another Shadow Crystal. Now Sean would be surprised that they came across a second one so soon, and wonder how our heroes came across it. Now they would tell Sean about the whole Spountain arc and pretty much how that whole fight went. Now Sean would give his usual dialogue about this, and besides that, he would add it to the Shadow Crystal collection. Now Sean would warn our heroes about what might happen with the next secret boss, but other than that, he would wish our heroes luck. So as our heroes would leave Sean's shop and adventure through Castle Town, we will return with Rousey. Now Rousey would send Queen on her way into the castle, while Rousey is now left with the Pale King. Now Rousey would ask about what does the Pale King know. Now the thing about the Pale King is I don't think that he would be too open about his knowledge. So if Rousey wants anything about hollowness, Rousey would only gain either very vague details about it, or just any part of the Pale King that the Pale King feels comfortable about revealing. Other than that, Rousey would ask about what does he know about the Dark Worlds. Now, obviously, the Pale King would know nothing about it. Now, Rousey would ask him about the Light World, but the Pale King would just say that he is the eternal monarch of Hollowness, and also he would also tell Rousey about him being a higher being. Now Rousey would receive all of the information about the king, well, any information that the king would feel comfortable about receiving. But then the Pale King would reach a mind block, because the Pale King would try to search through his memories, but he feels like there's something missing. But so pretty much the Pale King would reveal that he knows there's more information, just he can't remember it. Now Rousey, knowing that Chris and Susie and the Knight brought Queen and everybody with them, but not the Pale King, and knowing that the Pale King knows that they are not a Darkener, is also adds to the confusion. Now Rousey would think for a minute, then Rousey would come to a realization that the Pale King might be a certain type of Darkener, but he isn't completely sure about it. Now Rousey would ask if the Pale King possibly have, well, maybe Paris, but the Pale King would obviously say that if he would have Paris, he wouldn't have been here. Now Rousey would realize that that question would probably could have been asked better, so Rousey would apologize. So Rousey would say that until he can figure out a way to help the Pale King and possibly, well, help him go home, he is more than welcome to stay here. Now the Pale King obviously not wanting to not be in Hollowness, because I'm going to say that the Pale King doesn't know the current state of Hollowness. which is, well, not good. So the Pale King would be skeptical about everything, but seeing Ralsei's kindness and also nice hosting, the Pale King would very cautiously accept, but the Pale King would still be on edge. So just like that, the Pale King is now in Castletown. But after all of that, Chris, Susie, and the Knight would eventually decide to go back to Chris's house. Now, since they returned to Chris's house, Susie would say that she would catch the two later, but right before Susie leaves, Toriel would open the door for our heroes. Now, Susie would welcome Chris and the Knight back, but she would see that Susie is with them. Now, Toriel, pretty much everything would go the same. So, Toriel would ask Chris if Susie is Chris's friend, and she would invite all three of them in. So, as Chris and Susie would do exactly what they did in Chapter 2, Toriel would tell the Knight that she was unable to find anyone that knows the Knight. So, until then, she tells the Knight that they are welcome to stay with her and Chris as long as they want, until she finds the Knight's family, or at least someone who claims to be the guardian of the Knight. But other than that, Susie and Toriel would of course be in the kitchen. Chris is doing exactly what they did in the ending of Chapter 2, and the Knight is just wondering, would just reflect on everything that just happened in Cyberworld, but mostly reflects on how the Pale King suddenly appeared. But as they reflect on this, they would feel that one of their charms is feeling different, and that is the Void Heart. But after everything, the Knight would go just as usual. So Toriel would of course see that her tires have been slashed, and she would call the police. But as Toriel would call the police, the Knight would of course go outside and investigate, and they would see that the tires have been slashed by someone, but they do not know who. So the Knight would return to the house and they would see Chris is making a dark fountain. Now, the Knight, knowing Ralsei's explanation, would try to stop Chris, but before they could, it's already too late. So, the dark fountain has been created, and everyone inside of the house would be swallowed by the darkness. And just like that, that is the ending of Chapter 2. Now, I know my Pale King explanation may have been very shaky, but just like I said, I am working with the information that I have tried to relearn, but then again, it's been a while since I delved into the Pale King. But other than that, this is what I would think would happen if the Knight was in deltarune Chapter 2. And just like that, I shall say again, I do not own deltarune or hollowknight because they belong to their respective creators, and if you like this video, you are more than welcome to like and subscribe. But other than that, this video is Captain Bones approved. And also, happy deltarune Chapter 5.